Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today, we step back into the fog-filled streets of Victorian Birmingham, England, to uncover what life was really like for the men who inspired the infamous Peaky Blinders. Forget the TV drama. The real story is darker, grittier, and far more dangerous than anything you've seen on screen. Welcome to the gritty streets of Birmingham in the late 19th century, a city that thrived on industry yet festered in poverty. Imagine walking down a narrow cobbled street, the air thick with smoke from the countless factories that towered over the city, their chimneys spitting black clouds into an already gray sky. The stench of coal dust and the smell of unwashed bodies mixed with the acidic tang of chemical waste seeping from nearby tanneries and dye works. Children ran barefoot along the sidewalks, clutching ragged toys or begging for pennies, their faces streaked with soot. The city was alive, but alive in a way that was harsh, unforgiving, and often cruel. This was the world into which the young men we now call Peaky Blinders were born, and from this world they had little choice but to adapt, survive, and eventually dominate the streets. The working class of Birmingham faced unimaginable hardships. Families often lived crammed into single-room dwellings where the walls were thin and privacy was non-existent. 8, 10, or even 12 people might share one room, sleeping on straw mattresses or threadbare blankets. Plumbing was almost unheard of, water came from communal pumps, and waste was often dumped into the same canals and gutters that were used for washing. Disease was rampant, and life expectancy for a working-class male rarely exceeded 35 years. Child labor was the norm rather than the exception, with children as young as 6 working long hours in factories, coal mines, or as chimney sweeps. Education was a luxury many could not afford, and illiteracy was common. For many young men, the streets were both playground and battleground. From a very early age, they learned to fight, to steal, and to negotiate survival in a world that seemed determined to crush them. The Peaky Blinders were born out of necessity. They were not merely a gang seeking thrills, they were a product of an environment that demanded toughness and cunning. These young men were part of the city's underclass, and their power came from their ability to navigate a society that was stacked against them. In the crowded back alleys and dimly lit pubs, they learned that violence and intimidation were tools of survival. They observed their elders, older gang members, and streetwise figures, taking lessons in loyalty, strategy, and the subtle art of controlling fear. They learned that reputation could be as deadly as a blade, and that a man who commanded respect through sheer presence could survive where others fell. Life on these streets was unforgiving. Crime was a daily reality, not a choice made lightly or for sport. Theft, burglary, and occasional assaults were part of survival, often committed against others who were also struggling to make it through another day. The Peaky Blinders became notorious for their audacity, for their ability to strike fear into their rivals and even into law enforcement, who often lacked the resources or the will to pursue criminals effectively. Their signature flat caps, rumored to have razor blades sewn into the brims, were both fashion statements and deadly weapons. The sight of a well-dressed young man tipping his cap could signal menace, challenge, or the promise of a fight. The Peaky Blinders' environment was one where every action had consequences, and the streets were a constant reminder of mortality. A man could be killed for a slight, beaten for disrespect, or imprisoned for the smallest theft. Yet, within this harsh reality, there was also opportunity. Birmingham was a hub of industry and commerce, and where there was wealth, there was temptation. The Peaky Blinders understood this and used it to their advantage. They were adept at running small businesses, engaging in betting and organizing protection schemes. Their criminal enterprises were not haphazard, they were calculated, designed to maximize profit while minimizing risk when possible. Even the most dangerous acts were undertaken with careful planning, knowledge of the terrain, and awareness of potential allies or enemies. Despite the brutal reputation, there was a sense of community within the gang. Loyalty was paramount. Betrayal was punished swiftly and without mercy. Members often came from the same neighborhoods, sharing not just the streets but family ties, friendships, and a collective understanding of the hardships that shaped them. This sense of loyalty was reinforced by shared experiences of poverty, exposure to violence, and a mutual understanding that survival required solidarity. They were a family, bound not by blood alone but by circumstance and necessity. The influence of the city itself cannot be overstated. Birmingham was a maze of narrow streets, canals, and industrial districts. The geography of the city shaped the gang's behavior, their strategies, and even their identity. Alleys became escape routes, warehouses became hideouts, and pubs became both meeting places and recruitment grounds. Knowledge of the city's terrain was crucial. A Peaky Blinder who knew every shortcut, blind alley, and hiding place had a tactical advantage over rivals and law enforcement alike. This intimate understanding of their environment was part of what made them so formidable. The social hierarchy of the city also played a role in shaping these men. The wealthy and the powerful often turned a blind eye to the activities of gangs like the Peaky Blinders, as long as their own interests were not threatened. Politicians, business owners, and law enforcement officials could be bribed, intimidated, or manipulated, and the Peaky Blinders became adept at navigating these networks of power. They learned that influence could be wielded as effectively as a knife, and that fear, respect, and cunning could open doors that brute force could not. The psychological impact of growing up in such an environment was profound. Young men were constantly confronted with the fragility of life, the omnipresence of danger, and the need to project strength even when afraid. They developed a kind of streetwise intelligence, a combination of instinct, observation, and learned behavior that allowed them to survive where others would fail. Fear was both a weapon and a shield. It could be used to control others or to protect oneself. They became masters of reading people, predicting behavior, and exploiting weaknesses. Yet, despite their toughness, these men were not devoid of complexity. Many were aware of the moral ambiguity of their actions. They lived in a world where laws were often abstract and justice was selective. They understood the difference between necessity and cruelty, and many had moments of compassion or reflection amidst the violence. Some maintained relationships with family members, looked after younger siblings, or contributed to their communities in subtle ways. These contradictions made them human, even as their deeds inspired fear and fascination. The daily life of a Peaky Blinder was a balance between survival and ambition. Each day began with the challenges of urban life, finding food, work, and safety, and continued with strategic planning, recruitment, and enforcement of the gang's influence. Nights were often spent in pubs, gambling dens, or patrolling territory, ensuring that rivals knew their presence and that the gang's reputation remained unchallenged. Violence could erupt at any moment, but it was always controlled, calculated, and intended to reinforce the social order that the gang had established. In understanding the Peaky Blinders, we also gain insight into the broader society of Victorian England. The stark inequalities, the harsh living conditions, and the limited opportunities created a fertile ground for gangs to flourish. The Industrial Revolution brought wealth and progress, but it also left millions behind, struggling to survive in overcrowded, polluted cities. In this context, the Peaky Blinders were not anomalies but products of their environment, a mirror reflecting the desperation, ambition, and resilience of the working class. The story of these men challenges our modern perceptions of crime, morality, and heroism. They were criminals, yes, but they were also survivors, strategists, and complex individuals navigating a world that offered few choices. To truly understand them, one must look beyond the violence and the legend to the human experiences that shaped them, the fear, the ambition, the loyalty, and the daily struggle for survival. Their lives were a constant negotiation between danger and opportunity, poverty and power, fear and respect. The streets of Birmingham were unforgiving, but they also taught lessons in resilience, cunning, and adaptability. For the young men who became Peaky Blinders, every day was a test of skill, courage, and wit. They learned to strike quickly, retreat when necessary, and always maintain the image of control. Their reputation was their currency, and they spent it wisely, building fear and respect in equal measure. The legacy of these men lies not just in their crimes, but in their ability to navigate a harsh and often unjust world. They were survivors in an era that demanded survival above all else, and their story offers a window into the human capacity for adaptation, resilience, and ambition. Through the lens of the Peaky Blinders, we glimpse the reality of Victorian England, a world of smoke, poverty, and danger, but also one of ingenuity, loyalty, and unyielding spirit. By walking these streets with them in our imagination, we can begin to understand the complex, often contradictory lives they led. We see the fear that motivated them, the camaraderie that sustained them, and the relentless drive that pushed them to carve out a place in a society that offered little mercy. The Peaky Blinders were not mere villains. They were products of circumstance, men shaped by their environment and forced to navigate a world that demanded toughness, cunning, and courage. Life for a Peaky Blinder was never simple. It was a constant negotiation between survival and ambition, fear and control, morality and necessity. Their world was one where every choice carried weight, every action had consequences, and every day was a test of wit, courage, and loyalty. To step into their shoes is to step into a world that is at once brutal, fascinating, and profoundly human, a world where survival required more than strength. It required intelligence, adaptability, and an unwavering sense of self in the face of relentless adversity. Life as a Peaky Blinder was not a series of random acts of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated existence, a constant negotiation with danger, opportunity, and reputation. The streets of Birmingham in Victorian England were a battlefield, and every day required a combination of strategy, cunning, and a willingness to confront the consequences of failure. The rules of the street were unwritten but understood by everyone who dared to walk its cobblestones. Respect was the currency, and fear was its most effective reinforcement. A young man without reputation, without the ability to project menace or command attention, was vulnerable in every sense. The Peaky Blinders understood this, and from a young age they learned how to cultivate an image that could intimidate, manipulate, and control the world around them. Every interaction was calculated. Walking into a pub or market, a Peaky Blinder carried himself in a way that demanded acknowledgement. A tilt of the head, a measured step, or a glance from under a flat cap could communicate volumes. These were signals understood by both allies and adversaries, a subtle language of dominance that was as much psychological as it was physical. To outsiders it might have appeared as arrogance or bravado, but in reality it was a matter of survival. In a city where rival gangs were constantly vying for control, the ability to project confidence could prevent a fight before it even began. Yet, when confrontation was unavoidable, the Peaky Blinders were ready, and the streets of Birmingham bore witness to countless skirmishes, brawls, and ambushes that left their mark on the city and its people. The Peaky Blinders were territorial by necessity. They understood that control over a specific patch of streets, a cluster of pubs, or a corner of the industrial district meant access to resources, money, influence, and protection. Rival gangs could challenge their authority at any moment, and defending one's territory required constant vigilance. Members patrolled their areas, aware of every alleyway, shortcut, and hiding place. They knew who lived where, which shopkeepers could be intimidated for protection money, and which policemen were willing to turn a blind eye for a bribe. This intimate knowledge of their environment gave them a tactical advantage over those who underestimated them. Violence, when it came, was precise and purposeful. A Peaky Blinder did not engage in mindless aggression. Every strike, shove, or cut served a function. Sometimes it was retribution for disrespect. Sometimes a demonstration of power to deter future challenges. And sometimes it was purely strategic. A calculated move to remove an obstacle or seize an opportunity. Rumors of razor blades sewn into the peaks of their caps became legendary, and while not every story was true, the mere possibility made opponents wary. A quick strike could disable an enemy, inflict humiliation, or ensure compliance without the need for prolonged combat. It was not just about winning a fight, it was about establishing a psychological dominance that could ripple through an entire neighborhood. But the Peaky Blinders were more than street fighters. They were entrepreneurs in their own right, albeit operating outside the law. Betting, gambling, and protection rackets formed the backbone of their financial empire. Local pubs, factories, and markets became arenas for both legitimate and illicit commerce. The gang's members understood that money and influence were intertwined. A well-timed bet, a carefully placed bribe, or the strategic backing of a local businessman could secure resources and power that brute force alone could not achieve. Their operations were sophisticated, requiring knowledge of human behavior, probability, and negotiation. While the violence of the streets made headlines, it was the shrewdness behind the scenes that truly cemented their reputation. Loyalty within the gang was absolute. Betrayal was not tolerated, and punishment for disloyalty could be swift and brutal. Members often came from the same neighborhoods, shared familial bonds, or had grown up together in the same overcrowded streets. This created a sense of solidarity that was difficult for outsiders to penetrate. The gang functioned as a unit, with each member aware of their role and responsibilities. Decisions were made collectively in some instances, but personal initiative was also valued. A young man who could demonstrate skill, intelligence, and bravery quickly gained respect, while one who faltered risked humiliation or worse. This strict adherence to loyalty and competence ensured that the Peaky Blinders remained a cohesive force, capable of exerting influence far beyond what their numbers alone would suggest. The social dynamics of Birmingham also shaped the gang's behavior. The city was a patchwork of wealth and poverty, with industrial magnates living alongside the destitute. The Peaky Blinders learned to navigate these divisions, sometimes exploiting the wealthy, sometimes manipulating their peers, and always maintaining a careful balance between visibility and discretion. In some cases, gang members acted as enforcers for businessmen or local politicians, blurring the line between criminality and influence. Their understanding of power dynamics allowed them to operate in both the shadows and the spotlight, making them unpredictable adversaries and valuable allies. Education, or the lack thereof, played a role in shaping the gang's methods. Many members had limited literacy and numeracy, but they compensated with acute observation, memory, and streetwise intelligence. They understood human psychology, could read intentions in a glance or gesture, and knew how to exploit weakness or hesitation. These skills were honed from childhood, in a world where survival depended on alertness, adaptability, and quick thinking. They learned to anticipate moves, manipulate situations, and turn even minor advantages into decisive outcomes. In this sense, the Peaky Blinders were as much strategists as they were enforcers. The daily rhythm of life for a Peaky Blinder was relentless. Days began with navigating the city, assessing threats, and managing operations. Nights were filled with socializing in pubs, reinforcing alliances, and occasionally engaging in confrontations. Sleep was often scarce, meals were meager, and every action carried risk. The line between safety and danger was thin, and mistakes could be fatal. Yet this constant exposure to risk bred resilience. Members developed a keen sense of situational awareness, a readiness to respond to threats, and an instinctive understanding of when to act and when to retreat. Violence was also a tool of social order within the gang. Disputes among members, challenges to authority, or perceived slights were addressed swiftly to maintain cohesion. This internal discipline ensured that the gang functioned effectively despite the chaos of the streets. Fear of reprisal, coupled with respect for skill and cunning, created a hierarchy that was both feared and understood. Leadership was earned, not simply inherited, and those who could command loyalty and navigate danger rose to prominence. The interaction between the Peaky Blinders and law enforcement was complex. Police officers were often under-resourced, corruptible, or unwilling to challenge the gang directly. This created opportunities for negotiation, intimidation, and manipulation. The gang understood that legal authority could be circumvented with careful planning, bribes, or strategic alliances. They operated in the gray areas, exploiting weaknesses in the system to their advantage. This ability to maneuver around the law was as critical to their survival as physical prowess. Family connections were another layer of complexity. Many members had siblings, cousins, or close friends within the gang, and family loyalty could dictate decisions both strategic and personal. This network of relationships strengthened cohesion and provided support, but also introduced vulnerabilities, as personal conflicts could escalate into broader confrontations. Balancing personal ties with the demands of gang life required skill, diplomacy, and sometimes ruthless decision-making. The culture of intimidation extended beyond direct confrontation. Reputation was built through stories, rumors, and displays of power. The Peaky Blinders cultivated an aura of unpredictability, ensuring that even those who had never encountered them firsthand understood the consequences of crossing the gang. Fear was both shield and weapon, and the perception of danger often achieved what violence alone could not. This psychological aspect of their operations demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human behavior and social influence. Economic necessity also drove their actions. Poverty created both motivation and opportunity. The Peaky Blinders were acutely aware that survival required resources, and they pursued them through whatever means available. Theft, gambling, protection, and even legitimate business ventures were all tools in the pursuit of stability and power. Yet they were not reckless. Every decision weighed potential gain against potential risk, and careful calculation often determined the outcome of confrontations or negotiations. In understanding the life of a Peaky Blinder, one must also appreciate the constant presence of mortality. Death was a frequent visitor, whether from disease, accidents, or violence. Members accepted the fragility of life, and this awareness shaped their behavior, their priorities, and their relationships. Courage was not a choice, it was a necessity. Survival depended on alertness, decisiveness, and the willingness to confront danger head-on. Despite the harshness of their existence, the Peaky Blinders displayed creativity and adaptability. They adapted to changes in the city, in policing, and in rival gangs. They learned new skills, adopted new tactics, and continuously refined their approach to maintaining influence. This flexibility was crucial to their endurance and their ability to thrive in a constantly shifting environment. The interplay between violence, strategy, and social influence defined their existence. They were not merely street thugs. They were shrewd operators, navigating a complex social landscape with skill and precision. Their success depended on a combination of fear, respect, loyalty, intelligence, and audacity. Understanding these men requires an appreciation for the multifaceted nature of their lives, where brutality coexisted with cunning and danger coexisted with opportunity. Ultimately, being a Peaky Blinder meant living in a state of constant awareness, balancing the immediate demands of survival with the long-term goal of maintaining influence and control. Every action, every decision, and every interaction was informed by the rules of the street. They lived in a world where strength alone was insufficient, and where intelligence, strategy, and social acumen were equally important. The streets of Birmingham were both adversary and teacher. They imposed harsh lessons, tested endurance, and rewarded ingenuity. The Peaky Blinders absorbed these lessons, becoming masters of their environment, shaping their destinies, and leaving a legacy that would fascinate generations. They were survivors, strategists, and enforcers, operating in a world where every choice mattered and every misstep could be fatal. By immersing ourselves in their world, we gain more than an understanding of crime or notoriety. We glimpse the human experience behind the legend, the struggle, the cunning, the ambition, and the relentless drive for survival. Life as a Peaky Blinder was not just about fighting rivals or intimidating the law. It was about mastering the rules of a world that offered few options, carving out a place in a society that often sought to crush those without means, and forging an identity that commanded both fear and respect. The Peaky Blinders were notorious not only for their violence and cunning, but also for the way they presented themselves to the world. Their fashion was not mere vanity, it was a deliberate tool of intimidation, status, and identity, carefully crafted to convey messages without a single word being spoken. In the smoke-filled streets and crowded pubs of Birmingham, how a man looked could mean the difference between respect and vulnerability, between dominance and defeat. The flat cap, the tailored jacket, the polished boots, and the crisp shirt were not just clothing. They were weapons in their own right, instruments of psychological warfare designed to project power and control. Every detail was deliberate, from the length of a coat's lapel to the shine on a boot, each element carefully chosen to reinforce an image of authority and capability. A Peaky Blinders cap was perhaps the most iconic element of their attire. The rumors that they sewed razor blades into the peaks of these caps are part legend and part reality. Whether true or exaggerated, the idea alone served a purpose. It created a reputation for lethal cleverness, turning an everyday piece of clothing into a symbol of danger. When a man tilted his cap at a certain angle, it communicated readiness, confidence, and a subtle threat. One glance at the brim was enough to remind a rival that he was dealing with someone who was not to be trifled with. In a world where respect could determine survival, these small visual cues were as important as physical skill or strategic thinking. Beyond the cap, the Peaky Blinders' clothing choices were equally intentional. Their jackets were tailored, their shirts clean, and their boots polished, often to a shine that contrasted sharply with the dirt and grime of the city streets. This attention to detail was psychological armor. A well-dressed man projected control, wealth, and discipline, regardless of his actual social or financial status. It created a sense of unpredictability in their opponents. A man could look respectable, even refined, and yet carry the capacity for sudden, brutal violence. This duality, appearance versus action, was central to the Peaky Blinders' strategy. They leveraged the shock value of contradiction, a gentleman who could kill or maim without hesitation. Their style also reinforced group identity. Clothing, accessories, and grooming signaled membership in the gang. Even small details, such as the way a jacket was buttoned or a scarf draped, indicated allegiance and hierarchy within the gang. Outsiders could often recognize members at a glance, and the gang's collective presentation amplified their reputation. Walking together, dressed sharply, the Peaky Blinders created an aura of invincibility and cohesion. Their image was a visual assertion of dominance in a world where intimidation was a vital form of currency. This attention to fashion was intertwined with their approach to violence. The Peaky Blinders understood that fear was psychological as much as physical. A man who looked confident and composed could control a situation before a fight even began. They used presence, posture, and eye contact to manipulate, intimidate, or provoke. A casual tilt of the head, a steady gaze, a slow adjustment of a cufflink, these gestures could communicate strength, patience, and threat simultaneously. They learned to wield these subtle tools to control encounters, often achieving their goals without ever needing to draw a blade or throw a punch. The theater of intimidation was just as important as its execution, yet fashion and presence were not only about fear, they were also about opportunity. The Peaky Blinders operated in a society where appearances influenced outcomes. Pubs, factories, and local businesses were social arenas where deals were struck, bets were placed, and alliances were forged. A sharp appearance could win trust, secure cooperation, and open doors to resources that brute force alone could not provide. Business and crime were intertwined, and the ability to project reliability or influence could be just as valuable as skill in a street fight. In this sense, clothing and grooming were extensions of their operational toolkit, allowing them to navigate complex social networks as effectively as they navigated the alleys of Birmingham. The psychological dimension of the Peaky Blinders presentation extended to their interactions with one another. Within the gang, appearance and conduct reinforced hierarchy and competence. Younger or less experienced members observed the veterans, learning how to carry themselves, when to assert authority, and how to signal competence without words. These lessons were critical in an environment where mistakes could be fatal and respect was earned through a combination of skill, cunning, and composure. A poorly dressed or unconfident member risked undermining the gang's image, reducing their personal influence, and even jeopardizing the collective reputation. The Peaky Blinders understood that strength was as much perception as it was action. This focus on appearance also intersected with their understanding of gender and social norms. Victorian England had rigid expectations for behavior and dress, and the Peaky Blinders used these expectations to their advantage. By presenting themselves as refined, well-dressed men, they could operate in spaces that might otherwise exclude or underestimate them. They could mingle with patrons in pubs, interact with businessmen, or negotiate with officials, all while maintaining the capacity for violence that few anticipated. The contrast between societal expectation and reality amplified the shock value of their actions, reinforcing their reputation for cunning and unpredictability. The Peaky Blinders' fashion extended beyond mere clothing to grooming, posture, and movement. Haircuts were sharp, beards were trimmed, and posture was controlled. A man who moved with measured precision communicated confidence and capability, signaling to others that he was in control of both himself and the situation. These elements of self-presentation were rehearsed and internalized, becoming second nature over time. Members learned to read one another's signals, anticipate reactions, and coordinate group movements in ways that maximized both intimidation and effectiveness. Violence was woven into this presentation. Even when walking through a crowded street or entering a pub, the Peaky Blinders carried themselves in a way that suggested readiness. Their movements were deliberate, their glances measured, their interactions controlled. The potential for violence was embedded in every step, a subtle warning to those who might challenge them. This combination of presence, style, and psychological acuity made them formidable figures in Birmingham, capable of influencing outcomes before physical confrontation ever occurred. The importance of perception also extended to rival gangs. The Peaky Blinders cultivated an aura of unpredictability, ensuring that opponents were never certain what to expect. A sharp dresser who might appear calm and composed could explode into sudden, precise violence. This inconsistency was intentional, creating fear and hesitation that could be exploited in negotiations, street encounters, or territorial disputes. They understood that the mind was as much a battlefield as the street, and controlling perception often allowed them to dominate situations without the need for overt aggression. Fashion, grooming, and demeanor were also tied to status within the gang. Leaders and veterans displayed subtle cues of rank, experience, and authority through their attire and conduct. Younger members observed, mimicked, and learned, internalizing the symbols of power and competence. This created an internal culture where appearance reinforced hierarchy and competence, ensuring that the gang remained organized and disciplined despite operating in a chaotic and dangerous environment. The Peaky Blinders' attention to detail extended to their weapons and tools. While the flat cap with hidden razor blades is the most famous example, They also carried knives, knuckle dusters, and other concealed implements. These tools were integrated seamlessly into their daily lives, hidden in clothing or positioned in a way that allowed for quick deployment. The combination of appearance, posture, and readiness created a multidimensional approach to intimidation, where a single glance could communicate threat, capability, and dominance simultaneously. Beyond practical considerations, fashion and presentation were deeply psychological. The Peaky Blinders understood the human need to categorize, judge, and respond to visual stimuli. By manipulating appearance, they controlled perception, shaping how others reacted, interpreted behavior, and made decisions. This mastery of social influence allowed them to operate with greater efficiency, negotiate more effectively, and assert dominance in a world where brute force alone was insufficient. The role of clothing and image in group cohesion was equally important. Uniformity, subtle distinctions of rank, and shared style created a sense of belonging, reinforcing loyalty and solidarity. Members who adhered to the code of presentation demonstrated commitment, discipline, and respect for the gang's culture. Those who failed to conform risked alienation, ridicule, or even disciplinary action. Fashion was, in essence, a mechanism for maintaining order, loyalty, and operational effectiveness within the gang. Social mobility, however limited, was also influenced by appearance. A well-dressed, composed Peaky Blinder could interact with figures outside the gang, including businessmen, politicians, and law enforcement officials, in ways that an obviously poor or disheveled man could not. These interactions often facilitated influence, bribery, or negotiation, demonstrating that clothing and presentation were strategic assets in both social and operational domains. The Peaky Blinders' awareness of image extended to their opponents. Rival gangs, local merchants, and even law enforcement were acutely sensitive to appearance. The ability to intimidate, manipulate, or control was amplified by projecting a consistent, commanding image. Reputation and perception became tools of negotiation, deterrence, and influence, ensuring that the gang could achieve objectives with maximum efficiency and minimal unnecessary risk. Even in moments of leisure or celebration, appearance remained a consideration. Pubs, social gatherings, and festive occasions were opportunities to reinforce reputation, display status, and solidify alliances. Members learned to navigate these spaces, projecting authority while maintaining the flexibility to respond to emerging threats. This constant interplay between presentation and behavior demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics rarely matched outside the gang's ranks. The Peaky Blinders' emphasis on appearance and psychological influence also reflected a broader understanding of human behavior. They recognized that fear, respect, and compliance were often shaped as much by perception as by action. By mastering self-presentation, grooming, posture, and movement, they controlled the narrative of their interactions, ensuring that others responded according to their strategic goals. Violence was a tool, but perception and influence were equally critical to success. Ultimately, life as a Peaky Blinder required constant awareness, strategic thinking, and mastery of both self and environment. Fashion, grooming, and presentation were integral components of survival, serving as both armor and weapon. Through careful attention to detail, psychological insight, and disciplined conduct, the Peaky Blinders projected authority, controlled perception, and reinforced their dominance in the streets of Birmingham. Their image was not superficial, it was essential, intricately linked to their strategy, reputation, and capacity to navigate a world defined by danger, opportunity, and constant uncertainty. In the end, Peaky Blinders demonstrated that survival in Victorian Birmingham required more than strength or brutality. It required intelligence, cunning, discipline, and the ability to manipulate perception as effectively as physical force. By mastering the rules of appearance, presentation, and psychological influence, They carved out a place for themselves in a hostile, unforgiving environment. Their story reveals not just the tactics of a notorious gang, but the broader truths of human behavior, social interaction, and survival under extreme conditions. The streets of Birmingham may have been dark, polluted, and dangerous, but they were also the stage upon which the Peaky Blinders perfected an art that combined violence, strategy, and psychological mastery in ways that few have ever truly understood. Life behind the violence for a Peaky Blinder was far more complex than the legends and tales often suggest. The streets of Birmingham were unforgiving, and while outsiders saw the swagger, the sharp suits, and the ruthlessness, very few understood the constant tension, fear, and calculated decision-making that underpinned every action. Living as a Peaky Blinder meant existing in a world where danger was omnipresent, trust was scarce, and survival was a daily struggle. Each day presented not only the threat of rival gangs, physical injury, or legal consequences, but also the psychological toll of navigating a city structured against them. The brutality and lawlessness were merely the surface. Beneath it lay a relentless negotiation with mortality, morality, and circumstance. Every Peaky Blinder knew that a misstep could be fatal. The razor-edged caps, the knives, and the skill in street fighting were not just for show. They were necessary defenses in a life where vulnerability could be exploited in seconds. Walking the narrow streets, even mundane encounters could escalate into life-threatening situations. The city was a patchwork of allies, enemies, and indifferent strangers, and discerning between them required acute perception. Each interaction demanded an evaluation. Was this person a threat, a potential asset, or irrelevant? There was no margin for error. An insult, a glance, or a gesture could ignite a brawl, trigger a vendetta, or draw the attention of the police. The omnipresence of risk shaped behavior in ways that were both subtle and profound. Every Peaky Blinder developed an instinctive awareness of their surroundings. They memorized escape routes, identified vantage points, and constantly scanned for danger. In pubs, alleys, and marketplaces, they assessed not only the movements of rivals, but also the positioning of law enforcement, the behavior of bystanders, and even the mood of the neighborhood. This hypervigilance was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but it was essential for survival. Life in the gang demanded a continuous balance between aggression and caution, showing force when necessary and restraint when prudent. Despite their reputation for fearlessness, the Peaky Blinders lived with fear as a constant companion. Fear of injury, arrest, betrayal, or death shaped their decisions and influenced their strategies. Unlike the reckless image often portrayed in media, these men were highly calculated. Violence was deployed with precision, intimidation with purpose, and alliances were forged with careful consideration. Even a seemingly minor skirmish was assessed for potential repercussions, both immediate and long-term. The street was a chessboard, and each move carried consequences that could reverberate for weeks or months. Prison was a frequent reality for many gang members. The penal system of Victorian England was harsh, overcrowded, and disease-ridden. A stint behind bars could be brutal, often involving physical violence, forced labor, and exposure to communicable diseases such as tuberculosis. For a Peaky Blinder, prison was a temporary setback, but it was also a potential learning ground. Many used their time incarcerated to observe human behavior, refine strategies, and build networks with other criminals. They emerged not only hardened, often more cunning, with a deeper understanding of the dangers and opportunities in their environment. Disease and poor living conditions were also constant threats. Overcrowded slums, inadequate sanitation, and limited access to health care meant that illness could incapacitate or kill. Peaky Blinders often carried injuries from fights that never fully healed, or lived with illnesses that weakened their bodies but could not be treated properly. Despite these challenges, they adapted, learning to continue operating while in pain or illness, reinforcing the perception of invincibility that surrounded them. Survival required not only physical skill but also resilience, endurance, and the ability to maintain composure under extreme strain. Family dynamics added another layer of complexity. Many gang members had siblings, cousins, or close childhood friends within the group, creating bonds that could be both protective and burdensome. Loyalty to family often dictated choices, forcing difficult decisions in moments of crisis. Protecting relatives, avenging wrongs, or ensuring the welfare of younger siblings was balanced against the practical demands of survival and strategy. These relationships strengthened cohesion, but also introduced vulnerabilities, as personal conflicts could escalate into violent disputes or compromise operations. The psychological toll of constant danger was immense. Sleep was often interrupted, meals were scarce, and the pressure to maintain reputation weighed heavily. Members lived in a perpetual state of readiness, where relaxation was fleeting and vigilance was essential. Mental acuity was as important as physical strength. Anticipating threats, reading intentions, and making rapid decisions could mean the difference between survival and death. In this environment, stress and adrenaline were constant companions, and the ability to manage them separated the successful from the doomed. Despite the harshness, moments of camaraderie and loyalty existed. Within the gang, bonds were forged through shared experiences, mutual protection, and collective achievement. Trust, though rare in the outside world, was precious within the gang. A Peaky Blinder knew that the man beside him could be a brother in arms, a protector, and a partner in strategy. These relationships were often reinforced by shared rituals, mutual respect, and the constant negotiation of roles and responsibilities. Solidarity within the gang provided a psychological buffer against the relentless pressures of their environment, creating a sense of identity and purpose that extended beyond survival. Economic survival was intertwined with violence. Many Peaky Blinders supplemented their income through gambling, protection rackets, and illicit trade. The streets offered opportunity, but it also demanded ingenuity. They had to balance the risk of attracting police attention with the need to maintain influence and generate resources. Every operation required assessment, timing, target, potential consequences, and contingency plans. Mistakes could be catastrophic, but careful planning, observation, and collaboration mitigated risk. Life behind the violence was a constant negotiation between risk and reward, and mastery of this balance defined success. Interactions with law enforcement were fraught with complexity. Officers were often underpaid, overworked, or susceptible to bribery, creating a dynamic in which negotiation, intimidation, and subtle manipulation were as valuable as physical skill. The Peaky Blinders learned to exploit weaknesses in the system, leveraging relationships, reputation, and strategic insight to operate effectively while avoiding incarceration.
Understanding the patterns, motivations, and limitations of law enforcement was a critical component of their survival strategy.
The fear of betrayal was ever present. Rival gangs, opportunistic allies, and even members within the gang could pose threats. The Peaky Blinders navigated this reality through vigilance, intelligence gathering, and strategic alliances. Trust was earned and continually reassessed, and loyalty was constantly tested. Members who faltered, disrespected hierarchy, or displayed incompetence risked expulsion or violent retribution. The gang's internal discipline was strict, ensuring that cohesion and operational efficiency were maintained even in the face of external chaos. Violence was not random, it was calculated, strategic, and often a last resort. The Peaky Blinders understood the costs of unnecessary aggression. It drew attention from rivals, the public, and law enforcement. They employed intimidation, psychological manipulation, and calculated displays of force to achieve objectives while minimizing exposure. Even when a fight was inevitable, it was approached with tactics and precision. A single decisive action could neutralize a threat, assert dominance, or reinforce reputation without prolonged conflict. Daily life demanded adaptability. Circumstances could change rapidly. A rival gang might challenge territory, a police officer might increase scrutiny, or an economic opportunity could arise unexpectedly. Peaky Blinders developed the ability to assess situations quickly, make informed decisions, and pivot strategies as needed. This adaptability was essential, allowing them to maintain influence and survive in a volatile environment where static behavior was often fatal. Social networks extended beyond the gang. The Peaky Blinders interacted with merchants, laborers, and influential figures, navigating a complex web of relationships that could provide protection, intelligence, or resources. Strategic alliances were formed, maintained, and occasionally dissolved based on changing circumstances. Members learned to assess the reliability and utility of individuals, using social intelligence to enhance operational effectiveness. Survival depended not only on physical skill, but also on the ability to manage relationships, perceive intent, and manipulate outcomes. Despite their violent reputation, the Peaky Blinders demonstrated foresight and restraint. They understood that reckless action could compromise both immediate safety and long-term objectives. Patience, observation, and strategic calculation were critical. Members developed an internal discipline that allowed them to delay gratification, avoid unnecessary conflict, and position themselves advantageously for maximum impact. Life behind the violence was therefore as much about mental acuity and self-control as it was about physical prowess. The threat of mortality shaped daily decisions. Exposure to disease, injury, and violence demanded caution, resourcefulness, and resilience. Members learned to care for minor injuries, manage pain, and maintain operational capability despite adversity. Survival was both a physical and psychological challenge, requiring continuous effort, vigilance, and strategic thinking. The Peaky Blinders lived in an environment where death was a tangible possibility, and every choice carried weight. Life behind the violence also demanded personal sacrifice. Family ties, leisure, and comfort were often secondary to the demands of survival and strategy. Members devoted energy, time, and focus to maintaining reputation, managing operations, and anticipating threats. The constant pressure forged resilience, sharpened instincts, and honed decision-making skills. Yet, these sacrifices were made within a framework of purpose, maintaining influence, asserting dominance, and ensuring survival in a world where opportunity and danger were inseparable. Psychological resilience was essential. Members faced constant stress, uncertainty, and exposure to trauma. The ability to compartmentalize fear, manage emotion, and project confidence was as important as any weapon. This resilience was cultivated through experience, observation, and the support of the gang. Mentorship, shared knowledge, and modeled behavior reinforced coping strategies, ensuring that members could function effectively even under extreme pressure. In essence, life behind the violence for a Peaky Blinder was a continuous negotiation with risk, mortality, and morality. It required a balance of aggression, strategy, social intelligence, and psychological endurance. Every decision carried consequences, every interaction was fraught with potential danger, and every day demanded skill, awareness, and adaptability. Violence, reputation, and strategy were interwoven into the fabric of existence, creating a life that was perilous, demanding, and intensely disciplined. Ultimately, the Peaky Blinders survived not only because of their strength or weapons, but because they mastered the art of navigating complexity. They balanced threat and opportunity, loyalty and strategy, fear and influence. Their existence was a continuous exercise in adaptation, resilience, and calculated risk. Life behind the violence revealed the depth of their intelligence, the subtlety of their tactics, and the human capacity to endure and thrive in extreme circumstances. Their story is a testament to the interplay of environment, psychology, and survival, offering insight into a world where every moment was a test of skill, courage, and ingenuity. The legacy of the Peaky Blinders stretches far beyond the narrow, soot-stained streets of Victorian Birmingham. Their influence was not simply in the criminal acts they committed, the battles they fought, or the fear they inspired, but in the complex imprint they left on society, culture, and the understanding of human behavior. To appreciate their legacy fully, one must look beyond sensationalized myths and consider the men themselves, their choices, their environment, and the social conditions that produced them. These were individuals shaped by circumstance, molded by hardship, and driven by the twin forces of survival and ambition. Their story is not merely one of crime, it is a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the human desire to assert identity and control in a world that offered few options. The Peaky Blinders were products of their environment, yet they also actively shaped it. Victorian Birmingham was a city defined by stark contrasts, immense wealth generated by industry juxtaposed against pervasive poverty, filth, and overcrowding. The Industrial Revolution had created economic opportunity, but these opportunities were unevenly distributed, leaving vast populations struggling to survive in slums. Within this context, gangs like the Peaky Blinders thrived, filling social, economic, and territorial gaps in ways that were both feared and begrudgingly respected. Their operations influenced the neighborhoods they occupied, the local businesses they interacted with, and even the local governance that had to contend with their presence. They were a force that commanded attention, and their actions reverberated beyond immediate violence or theft. The social and economic pressures that gave rise to the Peaky Blinders also contributed to their cultural significance. Their lives reflected the harsh realities of working-class existence, and through them one can trace the contours of a society grappling with inequality, industrialization, and urbanization. They became symbols of defiance and adaptation, illustrating how individuals respond to systemic constraints and limited opportunity. Their methods, violence, intimidation, strategic alliances, and careful cultivation of reputation, revealed an acute understanding of power dynamics, human psychology, and the necessity of survival in a world stacked against them. Part of their enduring legacy lies in their ability to navigate complex social hierarchies. They were not simply thugs, they were operators who understood leverage, influence, and negotiation. Their presence in pubs, markets, factories, and neighborhoods allowed them to interact with a broad spectrum of society, from laborers to businessmen, from politicians to law enforcement officers. These interactions were often subtle, involving the manipulation of perception, the strategic use of fear, and the careful balancing of alliances. By mastering social dynamics, they were able to extend their influence far beyond what their numbers might suggest. They became a kind of informal authority within certain districts, feared yet sometimes relied upon, capable of enforcing order when formal institutions failed or were absent. The psychological imprint of the Peaky Blinders is equally important. They demonstrated an intuitive understanding of human behavior that remains remarkable even by modern standards. Fear, respect, loyalty, and reputation were not abstract concepts, they were tools to be wielded with precision. A glance, a posture, or a calculated act of aggression could shape the actions of others, often achieving objectives without prolonged violence. Their legacy includes a model of how individuals and groups can manipulate perception and social dynamics to maintain influence, survive adversity, and negotiate power in hostile environments. Violence, while central to their mythos, was always contextualized by strategy and necessity. The Peaky Blinders were not indiscriminate in their aggression. They employed force tactically, understanding that every act had repercussions. Retaliation, reputation, territorial control, and economic gain all influenced their choices. This calculated approach distinguished them from mere street criminals, revealing an intelligence and discipline that was often overshadowed by tales of brutality. Their ability to combine physical skill, psychological acumen, and strategic foresight allowed them to maintain dominance in an environment characterized by instability, competition, and risk. The legacy of loyalty and internal cohesion is another enduring aspect. Within the gang, relationships were reinforced by shared experience, familial bonds, and mutual reliance. Betrayal was met with swift consequences, ensuring discipline and operational efficiency. This culture of loyalty and accountability created a resilient social structure capable of withstanding internal and external pressures. It illustrates the importance of trust, hierarchy, and shared values in any high-stakes environment, providing a lens through which to understand not only criminal organizations but also broader social and organizational dynamics. Economically, the Peaky Blinders exemplified adaptability and resourcefulness. They navigated limited opportunities by blending legitimate and illicit activities, creating a hybrid approach to survival and enterprise. Betting, protection schemes, small businesses, and occasional criminal enterprises were all part of a portfolio designed to maximize gain while mitigating risk. This entrepreneurial spirit, born of necessity, demonstrates how marginalized populations can leverage ingenuity to carve out niches of power and influence in constrained circumstances. Their methods underscore the interplay between economic scarcity, opportunity, and strategic action, revealing insights into human behavior that transcend the immediate context of crime. Culturally, their legacy persists in the fascination they inspire. The Peaky Blinders have become emblematic of a particular period in English history, reflecting the intersection of industrialization, urbanization, and working-class struggle. They represent both fear and admiration, fear because of their capacity for violence and unpredictability, and admiration because of their cunning, resilience, and ability to assert identity in a world that offered few options. This duality contributes to their enduring mythos, ensuring that their story continues to captivate historians, writers, and popular audiences alike. The gender dynamics within the gang's legacy are also significant. While the Peaky Blinders themselves were primarily men operating in a patriarchal society, their interactions with women, family members, partners, and allies reveal a nuanced understanding of influence, loyalty, and social negotiation. Women often played critical roles in sustaining households, managing finances, or supporting operations indirectly, highlighting the interconnectedness of family, community, and criminal enterprise. Recognizing these contributions adds depth to the narrative, illustrating the broader social ecosystem within which the gang operated. The moral ambiguity of their legacy cannot be overstated. While they were undeniably involved in criminal activity, their actions were often motivated by survival, protection, and a response to systemic injustice. Poverty, limited social mobility, and harsh living conditions constrained choices, creating an environment in which aggression, cunning, and manipulation were not merely options, but necessities. Understanding the Peaky Blinders requires acknowledging this context, recognizing that their behavior was a rational response to a world structured against them, rather than simply a reflection of innate criminality. Their influence extended beyond immediate neighborhoods. Tales of their cunning, ruthlessness, and fashion-conscious intimidation spread through cities, inspiring both fear and emulation. Other gangs and individuals learned from their strategies, adopting similar methods of psychological manipulation, loyalty enforcement, and tactical violence. In this sense, the Peaky Blinders contributed to the evolution of urban criminal culture, demonstrating how reputation, strategy, and social intelligence can be deployed effectively in high-risk environments. The interplay between environment and individual agency is central to understanding their legacy. They were shaped by poverty, industrialization, and urban density, yet they also actively shaped their surroundings, influencing social order, economic activity, and local power dynamics. This bidirectional influence highlights a fundamental principle. Humans respond to constraints not merely by enduring them, but by finding creative, adaptive, and sometimes morally ambiguous ways to assert control, secure resources, and maintain identity. Education and skill development played a subtler role in their legacy. Despite limited formal education, members developed specialized knowledge in observation, negotiation, and social psychology. They honed physical skills, mastered street fighting techniques, and cultivated the ability to assess risk and opportunity. These forms of informal education were critical to survival and success, demonstrating that intelligence and capability can be developed outside conventional systems when necessity drives innovation and learning. Their legacy also prompts reflection on justice and societal structure. The Peaky Blinders operated within a city where law enforcement was under-resourced, corruptible, or constrained by bureaucracy. Their actions reveal the gaps and limitations of formal systems in addressing social inequality, providing insight into how informal networks, negotiation, and reputation-based authority can emerge in response. The Peaky Blinders, in effect, became an alternative mechanism of social regulation, albeit one grounded in fear and coercion rather than legal principle. Psychologically, the Peaky Blinders demonstrate the impact of sustained exposure to danger, scarcity, and social marginalization. Members developed resilience, strategic foresight, and acute situational awareness, alongside the capacity for loyalty, empathy, and moral reasoning within their social framework. Their behavior reflects the adaptive capacities of humans under extreme stress, highlighting the interplay between environment, social structure, and individual psychology. Studying their legacy provides lessons in resilience, leadership, and the complex dynamics of power and influence. The aesthetic and symbolic elements of their legacy endure as well. Their distinctive fashion, from the flat caps to tailored suits, communicated identity, cohesion, and intimidation. These symbols transcended practical function, becoming markers of reputation, skill, and group identity. This demonstrates the power of visual culture as a mechanism of influence, showing how presentation, style, and symbolism can reinforce social and psychological dominance in ways as effective as action itself. Historically, their story offers a lens into the broader social transformations of Victorian England. Industrialization, urbanization, and social inequality created conditions that necessitated adaptation, improvisation, and often morally ambiguous behavior. The Peaky Blinders are both a symptom and a product of these conditions.